The first time I saw Mrs. Gable, she was standing at the very edge of my gravel driveway with her chin tilted up like she was scanning the horizon for a coming storm. And honestly, the way her mouth was twisted into that permanent sour pucker, you'd think she'd just spent the morning sucking on a crate of unripe lemons. I'm Silas Thorne, and all I ever wanted was a place where the only thing I had to listen to was the wind moving through the pines and maybe the occasional crack of a dry branch under a buck's hoof, which is exactly why I poured every cent of my life savings from 15 years of welding into 22 acres of raw, beautiful timberland out in the Cascades. It was unincorporated land, meaning no city taxes, no cookie-cutter streetlights, and most importantly, absolutely no homeowners association breathing down my neck, or so I thought until the morning I finished bolting the steel ladder onto my new custom deer stand. I was wiped out, just wiping the grease and sawdust off my forehead, when I heard the unmistakable crunch of expensive loafers on my dirt path, and there she was, Regina Gable, the self-appointed queen of the Whispering Oaks development that sat just over the ridge, looking at my property like I just dumped a pile of radioactive waste in her rose garden. She didn't oppose to even say hello. She just pointed a manicured finger at my stand, which I'd built solid, painted in deep forest drab, and tucked 20 yards behind my own survey stakes. And she snapped, "That eyesore has to come down by Monday, Mr. Thorne, as we don an oppose. To allow permanent hunting structures within sight of the oaks and oppose perimeter. It's a violation of our architectural harmony, and quite frankly, it's a safety liability for our children." I just stood there for a second, leaning against my truck, and I let out a little laugh because I genuinely thought she was joking. But when her face turned a shade of purple that matched her expensive windbreaker, I realized she was dead serious. So I just calmly told her that since my land was and oppose, part of her little kingdom, her harmony was and oppose, my problem. She didn't oppose, like that one bit. And as she marched back toward her SUV, she screamed over her shoulder that I'd regret being difficult, which, looking back, was the moment I should have known this was and oppose. Gonna be a simple bad neighbor situation, but a full-blown war for my right to exist on my own dirt. 3 days later, I came home from the shop to find a bright neon yellow cease and desist order taped to my gate, not from the county, but on Whispering Oaks letterhead, claiming I owed them $200 a day in fines for an unauthorized auxiliary structure and I just shook my head, tossed in the burn barrel, and went about my night. But Regina wasn't oppose, playing around, because the next morning, a guy named Deputy Vance showed up at my door, looking real uncomfortable, telling me he'd received a call about a high-velocity projectile hazard near a residential zone, and he had to come out and measure the distance from my stand to the nearest house. Vance was a good guy, a local who knew exactly who Regina was, and after he spent 10 minutes looking at my property map and seeing that I was nearly a quarter mile from the nearest HOA roof, he just sighed and told me I was totally fine, but warned me that Regina had a cousin on the county council, and she was the type of woman who'd burn a forest down just to kill one spider. She didn't oppose. That warning turned into a nightmare faster than I could have imagined, because by the following Tuesday, I found a crew of guys in orange vests hammering survey stakes deep into the middle of my western meadow, acting like they owned the place, and when I ran out there asking what the hell they were doing, the foreman showed me a work order for Community Greenbelt Buffer, Apparently, the HOA board had filed an emergency petition to annex a 50-foot strip of my private land into their jurisdiction, claiming it was an abandoned utility easement that they had the right to, reclaim, for a walking trail, which was a total, bold-faced lie since my deed was as clean as a whistle. I had to call my old friend Miller, a retired property lawyer who lived in a cabin 3 miles up the road, and when he saw the paperwork they'd filed, his face went pale, and he told me, Silas, they aren't in oppose. Just trying to stop you from hunting, they in oppose. Trying to devalue your land until you in oppose. Forced to sell it to them for pennies so they can expand their development. And they're using every dirty trick in the book to do it. It got personal after that. Real personal, because while Miller and I were preparing our countersuit, I woke up at 3 a.m. to the smell of something chemical and the sound of a dull rhythmic thump, thump, thump coming from the woods. I grabbed my flashlight and ran out there, and my heart just dropped in my stomach. My deer stand, the one I'd spent 3 weekends building with my own hands, was engulfed in a weird blue-tinged flame, and whoever did it had used some kind of industrial accelerant that ate right through the treated wood and the seat cushions. By the time I got there with a fire extinguisher, it was a skeleton of charred timber, and as I stood there in the dark, watching the last of the embers die out, I saw a pair of taillights disappearing over the ridge toward Whispering Oaks, and I knew right then that the Harmony Regina wanted was bought with gasoline and matches. I didn't oppose. T called the police right away, because I knew Regina would just claim it was a stray hiker or a lightning strike. So instead, I spent the next 48 hours mounting hidden cellular link trail cameras high up in the hemlocks, camouflaged, so, well, even a squirrel wouldn't oppose. T see them. And I waited. I didn't oppose. T have to wait long, because Regina Gable was nothing if not arrogant, and she showed up on my porch 2 days later with sympathy card and an offer to buy my troubled acreage for about 30% of what I'd paid for it, telling me with a straight face that the unfortunate accident with my stand was a sign that the land was too dangerous for a single man to manage. I just looked her in the eye, took the card, and told her that not only was I not selling, but I was building a new stand out of reinforced steel this time. And I was going to paint it the brightest, loudest hunter orange the world had ever seen, just so she could see it from her bedroom window every single morning. The look of pure, unadulterated rage that crossed her face was better than any buck I'd ever bagged, and she hissed at me that I was low-class trash, and that she'd make sure the county seized my land for, environmental mismanagement, before the month was out. That's when the real counterattack began, because while she was busy trying to bribe people at the zoning office, Miller and I were digging into the Whispering Oaks financial records, which are public for any resident, and it turned out Miller still owned a tiny, undeveloped lot in there from the 90s, giving us full access. We spent nights huddled over bank statements and vendor invoices, and we found something that made Miller whistle through his teeth. It turned out that Regina had been paying landscape maintenance company nearly $15,000 a month for the last 3 years, but the company's registered address was a P.O. box in a different state, and the owner of that box was Regina's own sister-in-law. She wasn't an oppose. T just a bossy neighbor. She was a common thief, embezzling the HOA dues of all those families over the ridge to fund her own lifestyle and her legal vendetta against me, and she'd been using HOA funds to pay the surveyors who'd trespassed on my land. The day of the county hearing was a humid, heavy afternoon, and the room was packed with HOA residents who'd been fed a pack of lies about me being some kind of dangerous, unlicensed poacher who was threatening their kids, and Regina was sitting right up front like the guest of honor. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't oppose. Talk about the deer stand at first. I just pulled out a tablet and projected the footage from my hidden trail cams onto the big screen for the whole council to see. The footage didn't oppose. Show the fire, but it did show Regina Gable herself in her expensive windbreaker, walking onto my property at midnight with a heavy canister of citronella torch fuel and a box of long-reach matches, looking around with a smug little grin before she doused my ladder. The room went so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the back wall, and Regina's face went from smug to ghostly white in about 3 seconds flat. But I wasn't oppose. Done yet, because then Miller stood up and laid out the paper trail of the embezzled funds and the fraudulent annexation petition she'd forged the signatures on. It was a bloodbath, a total, glorious collapse of her entire house of cards, and the council chair, who'd apparently been one of the people Regina was trying to, influence, looked like he wanted to crawl under his desk, and he immediately denied the annexation and referred the arson and fraud evidence to the district attorney right then and there. By the time we walked out of that courthouse, the residents of Whispering Oaks were surrounding Regina, not with support, but with questions about where their money went, and she was standing there, shaking, trying to claim it was all misunderstanding, while the sheriff's deputy waited by her SUV to take her down to the station for questioning. I went home that night and sat on my porch, looking out at the charred spot in the woods, and for the first time in months, it was actually quiet. No loitering surveyors, No fake legal notices, just the sound of the crickets and the deep, heavy peace of the mountains. Regina ended up taking a plea deal for the embezzlement and the arson, serving 2 years in a minimum security facility and being forced to sell her own house in Whispering Oaks to pay back the restitution to the neighborhood she'd been robbing blind. The new HOA board sent me a formal apology and a check to cover the cost of my original deer stand, but I sent the check back and told them to spend it on a playground for the kids they were so worried about, because having Regina gone was payment enough for me. Now, when I'm up on my new steel stand, which is, as promised, painted a very bright, very visible orange, I sometimes look over toward the ridge, and I think about how people like Regina think they could just steamroll over anyone they deem, in quote, lesser, in quote, because they have a title or a fancy gate at the end of their street. They forget that some people don and oppos, take care about their titles, and that the truth has a funny way of coming out when you try to bury it under a pile of lies and gasoline. And honestly, it makes me wonder how many other, in quote, Reginas, in quote, are out there right now, trying to steal a little more than they're owed just because they think no one is watching. It makes you think, doesn't it, oppos? It? If someone came for your home, your peace, or the land you work your whole life to earn, how far would you go to protect it? And do you think most people would have a stomach to fight back, or would they just let the HOA queens of the world win? Let me know what you think in the comments, because I've learned the hard way that a fence only works if you're willing to stand behind it. And I'm not going anywhere.